Richie Merzian, welcome back to Afternoon Briefing. We're all trying to dig into what is a very detailed document in this integrated system plan. As a starting observation though, how different in outlook is this compared to the previous? Has the landscape changed a lot for the national electricity market?
No, between the draft and the final, really all this changes the urgency. We've experienced what happens when we don't plan out the transition. Now AEMO, the energy operator, is saying it's irreversible, the direction we're going in. The only question is how fast we need to get there. And also the benefit now is you have a federal government that's willing to play ball, that's willing to stump up the cash, to back in the transmission, to back in a much faster transition to cleaner, cheaper power. And
when it comes to transitioning off coal or completing that transition, in fact, it looks like they're envisaging a journey that will take less than a decade from now. I know in the state of Victoria, I think they're saying their last coal-fired plant would be about 2032. Is that replicated nationally?
Look, there'll still be coal in the system until a little bit after 2040, according to the plan, but the economics have changed. It's less viable to run these gas and coal power stations, given Australians have to compete on the international market for our resources to power our power stations. And so really they're saying the quicker we move, the cheaper it'll become in terms of our power bills, the cleaner our grid will be, and also the more reliable it'll ultimately be. Some states faster, Victoria being one of them.
Now, without getting into the economics of how these systems work, of course, this government is going to be using a thing called the safeguard mechanism and ratcheting that up so that polluters have to clean up their act. What do we know about the effort that will be built into that safeguards mechanism? Is that embedded in this system plan?
So the safeguard mechanism works on the 215 most high-polluting facilities. It doesn't really deal with electricity beyond treating the sector as a whole. And so really it sort of focuses on the industrial sector for the most part. How do we get those big polluters to scale down to net zero? So far, the safeguards mechanism has failed. It hasn't set trajectories to net zero. The federal government wants to do that. Separate to that, really, the electricity sector needs to transition. That's going to happen more based on this blueprint, and hopefully that'll keep to speed.
And so that system doing what it's meant to do is factored in to some of the assumptions here that AEMO has come up with?
Yeah, to some extent. I mean, the safeguards mechanism is sort of one tool,
sure.
The electricity sector another, yeah.
All right, so paint the picture for us in, say, 10 years from now for an electricity user in the suburbs or going to work in a city, as most Australians seem to live in cities. What are they going to notice is different?
Yep. I mean, firstly, the electricity that's going to be coming down the wires, the majority of it will be renewables. It'll be clean electricity, and alongside that, you'll probably be driving an electric vehicle, which means you'll be plugging it into this cleaner grid as well. So firstly, the electricity sector needs to transition to clean energy. Secondly, it needs to grow in size because there's more demand on electricity for our cars and for a lot more industry that will electrify as well. So it's a sort of a twofold problem, cleaning the grid and growing the grid.
Yeah, but then storing the power that these renewables are going to be creating, what's that going to look like? I mean, I know there are vehicles, you've referenced those. They are a form of battery that can hold power for a household, for instance. But what else is going to have to be built into our neighbourhoods to store this?
Community batteries will be a big part. We'll see them spread out across our cities. There'll be big batteries like the one that was built in South Australia. There'll be more pumped hydro like Snowy 2.0 and some smaller versions of that across the country. And then there'll be other sort of ways that we can build clean energy storage, potentially in hydrogen as well. So a real interesting mix of clean energy and backup.
And what do we know about the volume, the number of dollars that are going to be put in by investors to complete this transition? I think AEMO has crunched a number there well in excess of 10 or 11 billion dollars. What's the spin-off that comes from that?
Well, I mean, this is ultimately an investment. We know we have to build new generation. All our old coal-fired power stations were built by the government. They need to retire. We need to invest in new ones, and they're ultimately going to give us cheaper power. So yes, there will be, upwards of $10 billion in terms of immediate investment in transmission. The federal government's put forward $20 billion in this Rewiring Australia fund, and ultimately that will deliver us cheaper bills, a cleaner grid, and a more reliable grid, because the last thing we want to do is go through another crisis.
Yeah, and how confident can we be that crises will be avoided? I was reading an article, I think it was out of Austria only yesterday, where they are in one small town, to be fair, refiring a coal plant which had long been dormant, retired quite some time ago, because circumstances have overwhelmed them. We can't be certain that those things won't happen in this country.
No, but all we can do is really plan for the best case scenario. And for us, really, we are already reliant heavily on gas and coal. We haven't shut down as many as Europe might have done. But from this position, we know that they're becoming increasingly unreliable. Like, so many of them break down. A lot of them were offline in the last month. So to bank on them is to bank on more crises. Really, AEMO is saying let's move as quickly as possible. The federal government saying let's back that in, let's finance that. So if we do actually take this seriously, which we haven't in the past, then we shouldn't be having the same kind of dramas that we've been having recently. Okay,
and just because in this building, Parliament House in Canberra, so much is seen through a political lens, how much does it matter in driving the sort of changes that AEMO is talking about, that we have federal governments roughly on the same page as many, if not all, of the states? Why will that sort of cohesion count for much?
I mean, the disconnect we've had in the electricity sector is that you've had a federal government pushing for more coal and gas, and you've had state governments who are ultimately responsible wanting to expedite the transition. That hasn't left investors in a comfortable position as to where they put their money, so we've had an underinvestment in a grid that is not fit for purpose. Now that you have everyone singing off the same song sheet, we should have a far smoother transition, and also the federal government is ultimately the largest potential investor, and they're willing to actually stump up to cover a lot of these transmission investment projects.
We're talking about, from the private sector here, the generators, I mean, serious investors. Why wouldn't or couldn't they have in the past looked past some of that political disharmony and said, look, this makes good business sense for us anyway? Why is the politics so important in all of this?
I mean, a great example is AGL and then the current dramas they're facing. About 5 years ago, when they said we want to bring forward the closure of one of our coal-fired power stations, the federal government kicked up a massive fuss. They called the board members to try and convince them otherwise. They brought forward legislation, which they even called the big stick legislation, in a sense to beat them out of that decision. That's more than just sending the wrong signals. That's actually threatening divestiture. So you've had a federal government that's been pushing back on this transition and ultimately led us to the crisis we've been having recently.
Well, let's see where the future takes us. Richie Merzian, thanks for joining us today.
My pleasure.